Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Beverley Minster for this latest lecture by Marcus Ramshaw. I think most of you now know Marcus. Marcus studied at Cambridge and is enormously knowledgeable on the local history of this area. I mean, you only have to see the piles of books and bits of paper on his desk when he's lecturing to know that, and has really done not just general research, but genuinely original research on the history of Beverley and district. Now, any of you who are, like me, map enthusiasts and can't go anywhere without a 1 to 25,000 ordnance survey sheet will know that if you look at the sheets for this area, they are absolutely dotted with references to site of medieval village of X, site of. And there are, you go around the map and you keep finding them. What I've done with my maps is actually kind of highlighted them, but even I haven't got all of them according to what Marcus has found. Now, again, you may be familiar in historical terms with the great Highland clearances of the 19th century, when so many Scottish people left Scotland for the New World because they were thrown off their land in order to make more profitable use of it by great landowners with their sheep and also their shooting. But perhaps you hadn't realized that it was such a phenomenon locally in this area as well. And that's going to be the theme of Marcus's talk this evening, looking at the impact of these lost villages, of which we have many. And of course, as he will point out, I'm sure, fairly quickly, we have the most researched lost village in the country, which is Warren Percy, which some of you will have visited, and has been, I think it's something like 60 odd years now, going back to about the 1950s or so. There has been extensive research. So it is very much an area for lost villages. So can I just say that we have got some more handouts, but they're kind of dotted on seats. So if at the end you haven't got a handout, which is the one with the list of villages, and also a sheet which gives you full details of the next talk and then a list of talks on the back for the rest of the year, there probably will be some lying around at the end. And the other thing at the end, which we ask, is that just down by the main door there, on top of the one of the bookcases, there are a couple of collecting plates. Having the Minster open and all this printing does cost money and fees and things like that. So a donation of £5 would be very welcome. But now I'm going to hand you over, at least when I've switched his mic on, otherwise he won't hear him.
Good evening. Can you all hear me? Is this microphone working correctly? Brilliant. Thank you for coming out, and at least it's not entirely dark. It's a shame the clock's changed this weekend rather than the last weekend, but in future talks we'll be over by about 8:30. Hopefully you'll be able to go back in daylight as well as arrive in it. There's an awful lot I've got to cover in this evening's talk, because there are so many lost, deserted medieval villages, especially around here, and the reasons for their destruction are varied and complicated. So I've asked Peter to give me warning that I've only got half an hour, 45 minutes gone, 10 minutes left. There will be questions and answers at the end, and please do think about those questions and answers, because it enables me to happily cut out bits of my talk in order to meet the hour's deadline and give you chance in a question for me to go back to that bit. I'm going to have to be selective as I go through. Now, why should you give heed or warning to the words, "Beware of the sheep"? Somebody amusedly on a Facebook post pointed out, apparently I've got a great name for this talk. It took me a while to realize quite how Ramshaw would reflect on sheep. Now, writing in 1516, in a bestseller of his day, Sir and St. Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor of England and subsequent Catholic martyr, man made famous in the 20th century in the play and film A Man for All Seasons, wrote in his book Utopia, which you can buy in Penguin Classics, a satirical book describing the condition of early 16th century England. And I'm going to read out quite a long bit of it, because it's actually quite fun. And actually, it pretty much sums up my entire talk. So, this is straight from the Penguin Classics. The thing that compels the people of England to steal are sheep. These placid creatures, which used to require so little food, have now apparently developed a raging appetite and turned into man-eaters. Fields, houses, towns, everything goes down their throats. To put it more plainly, in those parts of the kingdom where the finest and so the most expensive wool is produced, the nobles and gentlemen, not to mention several saintly abbots, have grown dissatisfied with their income that their predecessors got from their estates, and they're no longer content to lead lazy, comfortable lives which do no good to society. They must actively now do it harm by enclosing all the land they can for pasture and leaving none for cultivation. They're even tearing down houses and demolishing whole towns, except, of course, for the churches, which they keep for use as sheepfolds. As though they didn't waste enough of your soil already on their coverts and game preserves, these kind souls have started destroying all traces of human habitation and turning every scrap of farmland into a wilderness. Indeed, that parable of the Lord Jesus Christ, I am the good shepherd, now that his churches are being used not for the sheep of Christ, but the sheep of the pasture for their wool, couldn't be more ironic or appropriate. Excuse me, well, I just seem to this must have slided down. Now, it's curious that Thomas More, the Lord Chancellor of England, is writing that in his book. He is the most powerful legal official and a devout man, the first layman to hold that position. He is the king's chief minister during the reign of Henry VIII. In 1770, Oliver Goldsmith, the Anglo-Irish poet, wrote a very famous poem called The Deserted Village, in which he lambasts the 18th century enclosures by wealthy farmers and aristocrats destroying villages. And actually, many of the enclosures in the East Riding took place in that period. It's a long, famous poem. We don't have time to go through it this evening. A couple of famous quotes about the parson passing rich on £40 a year. But he poignantly talks about these villages that have disappeared, and they're villages where people grew up, where they had their childhood, where they met their wife-to-be or their husband-to-be, where they shared their first kiss under the tree by the village pond, where they would play, where they would play the equivalent of poo sticks down the brook, and all this has just completely gone. And then, of course, I'm a lover and a sucker for musicals. In the 20th century, you've got Brigadoon, that Scottish village which appears only one day in 100 years in the mists. But for a long time, historians dismissed the idea of lost or deserted villages as either being exceptional or rare, or a myth. In fact, not to put a pun on it, a rural myth rather than an urban one. The lost village rarely existed, and when it did, those occasions were largely put down mistakenly to the plague or the Black Death. It was not until the pioneering work of Maurice Beresford in the early 1950s that the study of lost villages was taken seriously. And perhaps that work has revolutionized and transformed our understanding of medieval England and its social history, the lives of its ordinary people, both historically and geographically, more than any other historical discovery in the past 100 to 150 years. Maurice Beresford, a local lad, was Professor of Economic History at the University of Leeds from 1959 until 1985. And he started his work on the deserted villages of Yorkshire. And it's largely thanks to him, who started the work at Warren Percy, that we've learnt so much. Now, most of these former villages, whose tragic fate, even at the time of their desertion, was overlooked even by their contemporaries, even though complaints like Thomas More and his Utopia are beginning to be made. The fact is, through the work of Maurice Beresford, we now know that between a fifth and a quarter of every village in England that existed since 1086 has now disappeared off the face of the map. There are over 3,200 lost villages in England alone. And there are even more in Scotland and Wales. The vast majority, 80 to 90% of these, happened in the Middle Ages. Now, referring to your handout, I have given you, from Maurice Beresford's own book, which is a wonderful study, there's a copy here somewhere, of all the lost villages known in 1968, so this is nearly 50 years ago, in Yorkshire alone, for all of the free ridings. And here you will find, if I have that note, sorry, there are, as of 1968, 384 deserted medieval villages, and these are just the medieval ones, in Yorkshire. 129 of them are in the East Riding, 180 in the much larger, geographically speaking, North Riding, and 75 in the West Riding. Now, do take this away with you, because there's a list in there on the East Riding, this is the handout, alphabetically of each village. And for lovers like Peter of Ordnance Survey, I have given you the grid, well, Maurice Beresford has given you the Ordnance Survey grid reference as well, so you can find them on a map. There's some wonderful names here, which now only exist as names. There isn't even anything more than a farmhouse. You'd be lucky to find a chapel or a church. In fact, you might, unless it's been ploughed over by a farmer, find a few earthworks. But there's one with a wonderfully romantic name, which here is put as Talthorpe in Lonsborough, a village halfway between Market Wheaton and Pocklington, which was romantically known, well, I think so anyway, as Talthorpe in the Thistles. What a lovely address. I think all that remains of it are some thistles. There's the other extreme. The rather unfortunately named Pennisthorpe, which you could pronounce differently. Now, we're going to look at some case studies of these various medieval villages. But before we do so, I want to sort of point out that wool was the greatest wealth of England. And English wool, from the late 13th century, gradually throughout the 14th century, is our main export, and English wool quickly established itself as the highest quality wool in pretty much all of Europe. There's a brief bit of rivalry with Italy, but actually England really nails it on the wool trade, increasingly so throughout the 14th century and into the 15th century, and continues to do so into the early modern period. It was the black gold of the day. Now, it is no coincidence, and I'm going to argue here, and I'm afraid this is entirely my own theory, a controversial point, which I can, at the moment, half, maybe three-quarters prove. A bit more research will hopefully get me to completely nail it. But Beverley, the second biggest town in northern England after York, is built on the backs of the poor villagers whose communities were destroyed in order to fund the profits of Beverley merchants. Because Beverley, as an inland port, is exporting vast quantities of wool to the Hanseatic League. Where is this wool coming from? It interests me, the parallel, when that statue of, was it George Coulson down in Bristol, was thrown into the sea or the river by protesters at the time of the Black Lives Matter because of his association with the wool trade. And now we criticize towns such as Liverpool, which are built on the backs of the slave trade. We don't think about places like Beverley, whose prosperity, whose cargoes of up to 100, 200 pounds per ship, which would be about £1 million in today's money, full of wool, are going down the River Hull to the River Humber after the merchants, who also are lords of the manor of various villages, such as Talthorpe in the Thistles, have just sent that village to destruction in order to get rid of the villagers and install a shepherd boy perhaps, to look after a load of sheep. Because economically, there's much more money, not simply to be made into wool, but with the wool, you don't really need anybody other than a shepherd boy. Think about it. Arable crops make no money. It's difficult for farmers as it is today. Ironically now, we wouldn't make much money out of a fleece because of nylon and other artificial fibers. But in the Middle Ages, this destruction is unbelievable. Now, we will come back to that, but I've been trying to find various Beverley merchants, particularly in the Coppendale family, who I can directly link to a village that's been destroyed. And I'm getting quite close to several of them. The nearest deserted medieval village to Beverley is Eske, E-S-K-E, over sort of Woodmansey way. And all that survives of it is Eske Manor House. And this was a community of at least 200 people in 1377. Now it doesn't exist at all. But that was destroyed for its wool to become a sheep run, basically. The fate of these villages, in all these villages, of which we have poll tax records so we can work out their population, and we're talking of villages up to 500, 600, 700 people in population terms, which you could multiply significantly to compare them to today, that have disappeared, is astonishing. What happens to those villages? They will not be taken in by another village. Their homes will be destroyed completely, and sheep will just take over. There'll be no more crops to grow. They will literally become itinerant. They are homeless. They will be vagrants. They will have no skills, which are only going to necessarily be any use. They will die in the ditches. Now, that's not putting it, that's underputting it, really. This is a terrible destruction. Communities that have existed for 500 years, suddenly in the late 1490s, early 1500s, are destroyed in favor of sheep. And probably 60% of all the villages of the East Riding fall victim to sheep runs. It is no coincidence that the highest percentage, the highest density of lost, deserted medieval villages are in the East Riding, rather than the north or the west, because of their proximity to Beverley and to Hull, which is the biggest port in northern England for the wool trade. Now, we're going to look at some other examples before we come back to that. It is worth observing that there are several medieval villages that appear to have their development stunted due to the close proximity of rival neighbours. Villages which had fairs and markets, and might have been expected to grow into towns simply lost out to neighbouring communities which attracted trade at their expense. And even some villages like today, which you would expect to have come in towns, shrink. A good example is Barnby Moor, near Pocklington. And if you go through Barnby Moor near Pocklington, a village of about 1,000 people, you notice this very unusually wide, long village green. Barnby Moor should have really become a market town, but Pocklington, only a mile away, basically eclipses it, and Barnby Moor starts to shrink. A more extreme example, or another close example, would be Kilham, near Driffield. But also Water, on the other side of Pocklington, now a village with a population of about 96 to 100, was in the 14th century a market town with a growing population that could have easily eclipsed Pocklington. But Pocklington wins out, and then we see these other villages disappear. And doubtless other examples could be found. There are only a handful of very rare examples where we can argue the Black Death or its cumulative effects of plague, famine, or even Scottish invasion destroyed villages in Yorkshire. Mothorpe, Croom, and Gardham on your list are three such examples. But most villages recovered after the Black Death. It wiped out half the population, but within a generation or two, they will recover. And those that don't probably were pretty much on their way out anyway. But the most common cause of depopulation and desertion of villages was the changing use of arable land to that of pasture and for the grazing of sheep. Now, of course, you probably all know that Warren Percy and its surrounding settlements is the most striking and famous example of this. And at Warren Percy, there occurred during the late medieval period, but numerous other cases can be taken for sheep population. There's another site, though, a bit eastwards of Warren Percy, which will take you an awful long time to sort of find, but actually is really worth going out to see, and that's the village of Argham, A-R-G-H-A-M, near the small village of Grindale, which does still exist. Mentioned in the Domesday Book, Argham had a church which was taxed in 1291, and it seemingly had its own parish in its own right. And if you drive up that very, very, very isolated, probably the most isolated part of the Yorkshire Wolds, sort of out Dickering way, sort of halfway between Grindale and Bridlington, you can drive up a road and look down a country. It really is a tiny country lane. I mean, you've got good suspension on your car to get up there. You can see, because normally you can't see the earthworks clearly in a village unless it's an aerial photograph or drone technology. Even in Warren Percy, it's quite difficult to work out the humps and bumps in the ground and the hollow ways in which the street pattern can still clearly be seen. But you can at Argham because of the peculiar geography and look down on the village. And it's not been ploughed at all. It's a huge village. It's a scheduled ancient monument. And you can get a very, very clear idea from which is the street, which is the square, where the green was. You can even work out the house plots and how close they are to each other. Maurice Beresford, when he wrote his groundbreaking study, The Lost Villages of England, said, with a description of what must have been almost the most picturesque of all visits to a deserted village site, was that to the village of Argham, on the crown of the Yorkshire Wolds. To the east, the land drops quickly to the coast. To the south and west, the flat tableland is now broken up by the windbreak belts of trees. The site has not been ploughed, although almost every other field for miles is under corn. The exact date for the depopulation is not known. It had been forgotten as early as 1632. The church continued at Argham for a while, and it still had vicars instituted to it long after the death of the village. And it still had vicars appointed to become the vicar of Argham, even after the church itself had finally been demolished in the late 16th century. A lawsuit concerning the induction of a certain Master Pillane to be vicar of Argham sheds light on the former presence of the village. Witnesses And sometimes this is the only way we know that a village did exist, is this bizarre documentary record from later on. Witnesses testified to the institution of the new priest of Argham in diocesan records in the early 17th century. And the priest was instituted to be vicar of this big empty parish, which just had lots of sheep, how the institution involved the cutting up of a sod of piece of earth in the place where the church of Argham is supposed to have stood, and delivering the same to the said Master Polaine. The field was at that time bare grass. There was a cottage house where some people dwelt adjoining the place used as a shepherd, and his wife, who lived there, according to William Harrison of Rudston, just down the road. Asked where the church was thought to have stood, one replied upon that very place, but it has now been long since demolished. Other people talked about remembering parts of the walls of the church of Argham. Other places, which we know more about from later things, is the place of Kiplingcoats. That is a lost medieval village, and you now know it most famously for the location of the oldest horse race in England, the Kiplingcoats Derby. But actually in the Middle Ages, this was a large, thriving community. And one of the main reasons we know it did have a church is that in 1689, we actually know the fate of the church bells of Kiplingcoats Church. We don't know much about Kiplingcoats Church itself, apart from it existed, because there was a dispute over tithes in 1689, at least 150 years after the destruction and the abandonment of the village, in which, in payment of a penny of tithes, the former church bells of Kiplingcoats were provided, and an inquiry follows. There's even in that inquiry that they find evidence of where the town well was in Kiplingcoats Garth. The bells of Kiplingcoats Church eventually ended up in Middleton on the Wolds steeple, and for all I know, there they remember. Now, I've already gone through half an hour, and I could go on and list numerous other villages, but I'd rather you sort of ask me about them in the answers and questions later on. But there's a couple more I do want to talk about, because there was one other factor which, apart from the depopulation of sheep, did have a significant impact on the destruction of villages. And this was imparking. Imparking was basically the aristocracy and gentry build a wonderful house, such as at Sledmere or at Castle Howth, and they want a fair prospect. And that fair prospect does not include peasants or villagers interrupting their view. So the entire village of Henderskelf is demolished for Castle Howard to be built on its site. And there's been an archaeological dig that Henderskelf exists pretty much next to where the big posh fountain is at Castle Howard. At Sledmere, they're a bit kinder, and they actually do move the village a mile or two and rebuild it. So at least the Sykes family actually do protect the villages in this case, so they have a fair prospect across their deer park. But near Driffield, there are other houses which have either partially survived, such as Sunderlandwick Hall near Driffield, just on about a mile or two from Driffield railway station, where there is a clear sign of the medieval earthworks, which you can walk around in, and there's the odd World War II anti-aircraft battery built in the middle of some of them. And there are still parts of the old Sunderlandwick Hall built in the 18th century. And that was a huge, prosperous community, which was destroyed initially for sheep runs, but then imparked. So the fair prospect. But this wasn't just in the 18th and 19th century. It's clear that other previously thriving village communities, such as Burton Constable, disappear in the Elizabethan period in order for Burton Constable Hall to be built. And again, coming back to Pocklington, Kilnwick Percy Hall, where the Madhya Manka Buddhist centre is. You've still got the church there of St. Helen and the pond, but actually that was a thriving community of 200 to 300 people, which again was given over to sheep runs in the early 16th century. Now, the study of lost medieval villages isn't just an exercise in changing the historical geography, but also it does look at the sort of economic plight of England as a country and the collapse of the feudal system. So obviously you can make more money out of sheep than you can make out of arable wool, but this transition, the collapse of the feudal medieval system into a capitalist system, is no more clearly manifest in the destruction of these villages for sheep. Because sheep farming is essentially quite movable. You don't need to stay in the same place. In fact, you will move the sheep around to different fields. You'll actually move quite a while. So you'll move outside the village that once existed because you no longer need to be part of the village system, which also means you are breaking the connection with the lords of the manor. So the manorial system starts to collapse as shepherds take their flock to different places. And they can even sell that wool at various different markets. So it does allow a middle class and middlemen to prosper with very little commitment to any piece of land. Obviously, if you plant your crops, you've got to tend them after sowing, and then you've got to harvest them, you've got to stay put. This is not the case of sheep. Also, not only is sheep farming and wool much less labor intensive, because you don't have to feed the sheep, they're just going to eat grass. You only need a shepherd boy. But there are ancillary industries that can benefit in a way that arable ones couldn't. So you don't have to go, as I said, that palaver of sowing the crops, weeding it, and then the harvest. All you need is somebody to take off the fleece of the sheep for shearing. And then you need somebody to wash the fleece. That's it. Now, washing is pretty much unskilled, but you will need somebody skilled to successfully shear the sheep. So this creates a whole new, massively burgeoning middle class, which operates with several manners. The effect that this has on society is substantial. The studies at Warren Percy, and Peter was right to point out that this has been the longest archaeological dig ever in world history, has been the studies for over 40 years at Warren Percy. And now an English heritage site, you can go there completely free and have a look around. In fact, I've been invited to give this talk there at Warren Percy to a Walking in the Wold group or something in September. But even though there's been 40 years and every year there's been a study, archaeological dig there, only 10% of the parish of Warren Percy has actually been successfully excavated. So 90% hasn't, and the digs have now stopped. But what the digs at Warren Percy have done, they've tremendously enriched our knowledge of medieval village life. And some really surprising factors emerge and challenge the way we think of the medieval peasant. Now, you probably think, and it's pretty much generally portrayed in movies, even in TV documentaries, that the medieval peasant lived in a miserable, smelly, dirty little hovel. Would that be broadly true, the way it's characterized? That peasants, lived in a wattle and daub, thatched, hardly any privacy, hardly any space, and they were quite smelly and quite dirty, and they were little. And this is just not true at all. Now, one curious factor in Warren Percy to emerge was just how clean and how tidy the residents of Warren Percy were. So much so that they had their own tips. They had their own rubbish dumps at equal ends of the village. Rubbish was carefully disposed of, and only if it could not be used wherever possible for any other purpose, such as manure. But 2 medieval rubbish pits have been found, and the houses, the excavation of houses shows how much surprising archaeological digs in the chalk of the Yorkshire Wars can show. The inside of the houses, they have been swept with a broomstick so many times, so frequently, so regularly, that the marks of the sticks of the broomstick have been left permanently in the soil. Isn't that incredible? Almost like footprints, that the broomstick survives there. The various objects 30 minutes, found in the peasants' tofts and crofts also give interesting glimpses of medieval peasant life. So at Warren Percy, small hinges from chests and caskets, together with keys, you might think, well, that's a bit dull, but then if you think about it, this again shows the sense of private property and a concern for security. You're not going to have a chest with a lock or key unless there's something valuable and important that you're going to want to put in there. So maybe we should think about the family heirlooms and also a concern for burglary and theft. This may also suggest that the whole family would go out into the fields together, for if the wife and children were left at home, there would surely not be so much need for such security. The fragments of pottery, iron, copper alloy and bone give important evidence for the various activities that took place in the home. Pottery, obviously, cooking pots and bowls of food preparation. Jugs were rare to be discovered, but that may not mean there was some other liquid container made of leather or wood, which wouldn't necessarily survive. But there's plenty of examples of evidence for sewing, medieval thimbles, spindles, needles, and even scissors can be found at the Warren Percy dig. And one thing which was quite surprising, we had thought that oxen were generally used to plough the fields up in the East Riding of Yorkshire. This may well not be the case, because at Warren Percy, the medieval ploughing and other discoveries suggested that horses were generally used. And then, of course, there's the more grisly side of it, that in medical and the history of human beings, research conducted on human remains found at the now ruined St. Martin's Church at Warren Percy have been very revealing. 687 skeletons have been recovered. And this is from that report onto the human remains. The archaeological reports of Warren Percy run into about 25 to 30 different volumes. But this is what was learnt. Children were generally breastfed until they were about 18 months old, and this was effective in providing good nutrition and immunity. For the infant mortality rate was about 15% in villages. That was far lower than the infant mortality rate in Beverley, or in Hull, or in York, which was 40%. So nearly 3 times more. As soon as breastfeeding ended, however, the child's problems began. Rickets, a disease associated with severe malnutrition and lack of access to sunlight, was quite common in children under 5. Since outdoor life must have been the norm for the farming community, children may have had other illnesses that prevented them from getting outside, as well as very poor diets. Only one child in those 687 skeletons, a 10-year-old boy, was found to die of leprosy. However, a generally poor diet slowed children's growth, so that by the time they were 14, they were no taller than a modern 10-year-old, and even shorter than children of the same age living in 19th century slums. It seems, however, that people continue to grow into their 20s. For adult males reached an average height of 5'6", and females 5'2", which is a fair bit shorter than people today. Bone fractures, arthritis, and bone growth left by cuts and bangs all testify to the hardships of a farming life, while instances of tuberculosis point to unexpectedly frequent contact with nearby towns, where infectious diseases were much more common. But despite these dangers, 40% of adults certainly live to be over 50, and some individuals with serious physical disabilities were evidently cared for well enough to reach adulthood. In Warren Percy, there was clearly evidence of a delicate trepanning operation where a piece of the skull is removed, literally driving a hole into your cranium, certainly saved the life of a man who had been bludgeoned over the head because there was evidence of healing after the operation. Some treatment was less successful. A 12th century woman died of tuberculosis, and a caesarean operation had clearly been attempted to save the life of her unborn child. Then there's this really quite startling thing that was discovered, and it actually made the BBC News very, very recently, about 2017, 2018, after a final detailed study, because even though the archaeological digs ceased after 40 years, it still takes quite an awful long time, several years, to get through all the material that has been discovered with the dig. And this was conducted by the University of Southampton, which has shown that some human skeletons at Warren Percy were deliberately mutilated, either smashed or burnt by the villagers after death. The cut marks were not those of a butcher, ruling out any possibility of cannibalism from famine or from warfare. 137 pieces of broken human bones were studied with the most plausible explanation of burn marks and cuts on the skulls and a deliberate mutilation after death. And it was wondered, and it was a bit sensationalized, that these were the zombies or the vampires of Warren Percy, who had been deliberately treated so. So there was a strong archaeological piece of evidence of traditional folkloric belief of damaging corpses to prevent any possibility of the dead rising again to attack the living or to spread disease, that they had become or could become a form of undead. More disturbingly, it was clear that some of these skeletons had been decapitated shortly after death and subsequently partially burnt. The decapitated bones represented the human remains of at least 5 men, 2 women, and 3 infants, aged between 2 and 50 for the adults, buried in 3 overlapping pits between the peasants' houses and at a considerable distance from the church and from the graveyard. Now, moving to the houses, now I've already argued that the average medieval home certainly, or peasant, certainly wasn't dirty. Your medieval housewife was very house proud, sweeping her floor so particularly. They did have their own furniture that they made for themselves, and the excavation, if you go to Warren Percy, you see that the longhouses, the sizes of these properties are surprisingly big. We forget how crowded our country is today, but remember back in the later Middle Ages, in the 14th and 15th century, the population of England was only about 3.5 million. It's now 20 to 25 times more. So, we are used now to having postage stamp gardens and houses built as closely to each other, even potentially in villages. This was not the case in the Middle Ages. There was plenty of land. And the average house size of a medieval longhouse would be about 40 meters by about 15 to 25 or 30 meters wide, about the size of a very generous, large two-bedroom bungalow, I suppose, today, with outhouses as well, and with a yard, and with a fair bit of garden to grow your own herbs, and also you'd have some strip farming. So they weren't small. And when you go to Warren Percy, they've laid out clearly the dimensions of a couple of these manor houses, and these are the peasants' houses. Now, were they a hovel? Well, that's a bit hard to say, really, because I'm not quite sure what a hovel is. If a hovel is meant to be a mean building with a thatched roof made out of either wood or wattle and daub, well, to a certain extent, that might be true. Although it's quite clear at Warren Percy that a lot of the medieval peasants' houses had a chalk string course laid out as part of their foundations. And the reason they were generally built in thatched wattle and daub mud roofs is there isn't a huge amount of, apart from chalk, obvious good quality stone to be found in the East Riding. But the idea was that every subsequent generation wouldn't just re-thatch the cottage every 20 or 30 years, but they would rebuild the house. And they'd rebuild it in a way that was a bit better than before. And I know it sounds a bit daft, but actually we do find evidence that later on they start to put in a mezzanine level, potentially in some of these houses, even a second floor. It's a bit like the son and wants to build an extension and have a bigger house than the previous generation. And the grandchildren will go and do likewise. So characterizing their dwellings as mean little hovels seems to me pretty much wrong on every single level. Now, I'm coming up to the last 5 to 10 minutes. There is, of course, an unusual aspect to, which I'm sure you all know, to the lost villages of East Yorkshire, and there are at least 30 to 40, well, probably a bit less, villages that fall into this category, is the loss of communities to the sea. We, as I'm sure you all know, have the fastest eroding coastline in pretty much all of Europe on the East Yorkshire coast. And loads of villages are now beneath the waves, including probably two of the most famous towns in the late 14th century, both immortalized a couple of times in Shakespeare, Ravensor and Ravensor Rod, which are mentioned in Shakespeare's King Henry IV, and where King Henry IV Bolingbroke landed. It's down near Wivensey, between Wivensey and Spurn Point, and Bolingbroke will depose King Richard II and murder him. And also at Ravensor Rod later on, Edward IV will also land near there. But clearly there are two different Ravensburns, Ravensor Odds, which have made this rather confusing. And there has been a recent study by Hull University to find, and they believe that they have found it, these considerable towns, which are pretty much, and it wouldn't be such an exaggeration to say that they are the lost Atlantises of medieval England and of East Yorkshire in particular. But the 14th century saw these towns rapidly deteriorate through coastal erosion. And it is certainly true that more than half of Hornsey, modern-day Hornsey, is under the waves of the North Sea. There are 4 medieval villages listed on your map, which actually form part of Hornsey: Souththorpe, Norththorpe, Hornsey Beck, and then another one. So Hornsey would have been at least double, if not 3 times, its size in the Middle Ages. I hope that the rest of Hornsey today does survive into the future. Now, I'm going to begin to conclude. I'm going to conclude and give you a chance to ask me some questions. But I want to conclude largely with saying that there are an estimated 16,000 villages in England today, slightly over. These are minus, in 1968 there were about 2,400, 500 identifying medieval villages. Since then, we have identified 3,256 lost villages discovered by Maurice Beresford and the subsequent Deserted Medieval Village Research Group. So that is over 20, nearly 25% of communities which are completely lost. And there are still more waiting to be discovered. A telltale sign of a lost medieval village is often if you see a church just standing on its own, by itself, or an old farmhouse, which is called a manor house. Or sometimes you just, even if the earthworks are there, just this unexpected crossroads. Search around, and believe me, if you start looking, you will find, some lost medieval villages. You'll also find other villages which have shrunk so much that there's a town that's become a hamlet. And you'll even find rare cases, such as at Rise, near Rise, out towards Rowley, where the village has largely become a sheep run, and then later on, the lord of the manor has built a posh hall on it, and then in turn, that hall has then been demolished in the 1950s, and the whole place has returned back to being a farmstead again, just an ordinary farm. This strange sort of circle of life and wheel of fortune, which has affected this community. But there is something so poignant about the lost medieval villages, because these, until the arrival of capitalism, had existed since Doomsday Book, 1086. So the highest point of depopulation of villages was in the early 16th century. Now that is 500 years, nearly. 40 generations, 20 generations have passed. And another 500 years since then, we have seen as the in-between time. Now, if there is a lesson from history that can teach us one thing, is that we often take things for granted. And the things that we take for granted sometimes are so vulnerable, but we think they are impermeable. We take it for granted that there is a place called Walkington, called Leconfield, called Bishop Burton, with its very pretty pub at the Altisidora, called Cherry Burton, called Ticton, the village that you grew up in, I grew up in as a child at Wilberforce or Stamford Bridge. But their future is not guaranteed. In 100 to 200 years' time, they might be wiped off the face of the map by some change in history. The vicissitudes of history could yet wipe from the face of the map so many villages, which we just assume will always be there. And economics, as we learn for the moment in our changing world order, also can change quite viciously. Because I want to conclude with telling you why does the wool trade in England go through a sudden economic collapse and decline in the later 16th century. So it goes through this strange rise from the late 13th century, throughout the 14th and 15th and the 16th century, and then suddenly under Elizabeth I's reign, it starts to collapse entirely. And this is because of politics. And the last colony in England that England has as a result of the 100 Years' War is the town, port, and staple of Calais in France, which is finally lost to the French in 1558, in the closing months of Mary I's reign. And this was our only and principal way of exporting wool into Europe. And the rising power of Spain after this basically strangles the English wool trade, and by the end of Elizabeth I's reign, it is almost stone dead. So much so that actually, later on in the 17th century, the government deliberately tries to enforce people to be buried in woolen cloth, largely, it's partly said, that it will stop the spread of disease or plague, but actually it's largely to encourage a wool trade in which our exports have collapsed. So, goodness knows how current world order economically will impact our futures, but there's a lot we can learn from our medieval past. Thank you for coming. Is that okay?
There's always that silence when people are asked if they have any questions. So while you're thinking of questions, can I just put in a little plug? Marcus was talking briefly about the superstitions around Warren Percy. Can I commend to you a little exhibition which has just opened fairly recently in the Guildhall with the wonderful title, Boggles, Ghosts and Ragwells. And it's really all about the superstitions and the traditions of this area, right the way back into the Middle Ages, but also right up to things that I can remember as a boy in Hull, related to the fishing industry and all the kind of superstitions that they had. It's not a very big exhibition. It's just in the sort of the room as you go into the Guildhall. It's only really open mainly on a Wednesday and Friday, but it's well worth a visit to add to your sort of knowledge of the locality and its culture. But now we come to the opportunity to ask Marcus any questions. So has anybody got a question? Hang on, I shall come around with the microphones. The gentleman at the back, then I spotted a lady as well. I'll come back to you.
I'm so glad I finally managed for the first time to stop my talk within an hour. I've always gone over.
Hello, Marcus.
Hello.
I'd just like to say thank you very much for an exceptionally interesting talk. I've been to some of your others, but this is really very, very interesting. Now, the question I wanted to ask you is that as I'm a golfer, and a number of people here are probably also golfers, if you go around the Bridlington golf course, then you will see that there is remains of probably a medieval village about halfway around the course. I wondered if you knew what that village was.
I do, and I've been there actually, and there's about half of it that still survives in its earthworks. And I want to say Pockley, but I don't think it is. But it is on your list. Now, there is a wonderful website called, and you can all access this, and I do encourage it, it's called Beresford's Lost Villages. This is a printout of the entire website. And this is just East Yorkshire. The East Riding. Doesn't include North Riding, or the West Riding, or York. There's even a couple of villages around the Ainsty of York. So Bridlington is in here. We have to go through it for me to find the entry. But you can access this. So if you just type in, on a Google search, Beresford's Lost Villages, index.cfm, or if you just Google it. Here is a Rowley, where almost the entire village is left en masse to move to Massachusetts in 1632, led by their vicar. And there's an aerial photograph of the current village site. But they have compiled on here all the researchers across the country of what's called the Deserted Medieval Villages Research Group, details a sketch profile of every lost village with things known to date. So it includes the population figures for the 1377 poll tax returns, the amount of tax they paid and lay subsidies, the last references to the villages in the Tudor period, and even if the half tax could show up anything, and we keep adding to this database. So I encourage you to look at that. Have a look at it afterwards here. Does that help answer your question?
I think perhaps in fairness to golfers, we should point out it wasn't actually the golfers who demolished the village, was it?
No.
Because that would add an interesting new category to the deserted villages. Yes.
I mean, Kilnwick Percy near Pocklington is almost encroached on by a golf course, and so the Driffield one is quite nearby.
Yes, thank you, Marcus. That was, as ever, very good.
Thank you, Liz.
Do we know why Pocklington particularly should have survived so well when the surrounding villages collapsed?
Why does Pocklington survive so particularly well? I should know this because I've been researching a history of Pocklington for quite a while. Partly because of its proximity and its geography to the city of York, and being on the York-Beverley Hull Road, largely because of the Dolman family. The Dolman family play a big part in it. And its main rival at water, and for quite a long time until the 14th century, it's unclear which is going to become the bigger of the two, water or Pocklington. You have this in Driffield. You see it in all the geography. You have a big battle between Driffield and Nafferton, and also between Kilham. Of those three, which is going to come out tops? And it's not clear until often the Tudor period which is. It is on something of a knife edge. But the dissolution of the monasteries kills off water altogether, because Water Priory is closed and it never recovers from that. Why Barnby Moor doesn't get more of a head start, I'm not entirely sure. Obviously, the founding of Pocklington School makes a big difference in 1514. And the Dolman family come from the Archdeacons of Suffolk and St. John's College, Cambridge, so more money is poured into Pocklington. Driffield and Pocklington become something of a rivals, but Driffield doesn't really emerge until a canal in the 18th century. Market wheaton never really quite takes off. So that's the best answer I can give so far. There's a gentleman down here.
A couple of questions, Marcus. One, you mentioned that the wool was particularly fine from here. Is that to do with breed, or because I could imagine that other places would then take the same breed, or is it something to do with the terrain that the sheep fed on?
I'm not entirely sure. The best historian who's just published a book called The Wealth of England is Susan Rose, and it's called The Wealth of England, England's Wool Trade. But Eileen Power in 1939, in her Hilary lectures to Oxford University on the medieval English wool trade, which you could easily buy a copy of online on eBay for not very much, does actually give the leading study of which areas of England produced the best wool. And the best wool was produced in Yorkshire and Lincolnshire. The worst wool was in Devon and Cornwall. Now, quite why that certain breeds excelled here, so it might be part to do with the grass or something like that. I'm not a farmer. But it is also clear that the best people in the wool trade were the Cistercian monks. And so Rievaulx Abbey and Fountains Abbey and other monasteries such as Mew near Hull become the biggest wool traders. And they have flocks of 20, 30, 40,000 sheep, just at one abbey. And they're the main exporters to the continent. And by the late 14th century, English wool becomes so good, Beverley becomes a reputation for a particular type of dyeing of wool called burnet cloth, which is a particular sort of brown type of dye that's used, and Beverley becomes famous for it, Beverley of burnet cloth or something like that, which Venetians and Lombardy will pay massive sums of money for. And we do, in that sort of 15th century, become the best exporters of wool in all of Europe.
And a quick second one. Is there any evidence of any resistance to a village being forcibly depopulated, either by the inhabitants or people with a sort of moral objection?
Well, apart from Thomas More's Utopia, and that was a shocking book, I do encourage you to read it. And I mean, actually, it's quite a remarkable sort of study, because Thomas More, who's a devout Catholic, it's a satire, and it's very, very ironic. I mean, he actually ends up arguing that we should have divorce, we should have a form of, that money has been so bad that he argues for a sort of initial sort of rebellion and recreation of a communist state, before communism, because of the depopulation of the villages. But no, because the villages happen very, very gradually. And it's not like the dissolution where it happens in 4 years. And between 1536 and 1540, 800 communities of religious monks and nuns have been destroyed. In the villages, it's probably once every 10 or 20 years another village is just gone. And they're all over the place. And it's too late when people realize that this is happening in a widespread way. After a generation or two, people start to wake up to it. There is the beginning of a rebellion in Elizabeth I's reign, and things like Kett's rebellion in Edward VI's reign in 1548, 1549. Kett's rebellion in Norwich is largely, and the Pilgrimage of Grace is after the dissolution of the monasteries, the main grievance of the rebels is the enclosure of villages and then beginning of the sheep runs. It's the main economic factor, but it is now so far advanced, it's too little, too late.
I did some looking up because I have a particular interest in the Cistercians. And I was looking up about how the monasteries did things, and I did find one protest from a Bishop of Carlisle writing to the abbot of the Abbey of Home Coultram, which is in the sort of the bit of Cumbria between the Lake District and Carlisle. And incidentally, one of the only, I think I mentioned it last time, one of the only other Cistercian buildings other than Swine still in use. And he actually writes to the abbot of Home Coultram saying, look, I've heard rather alarming reports of what you're doing to your tenants in order to chuck them off the land for sheep. But that's, I think, a rare example.
Yeah, I think also there is, the villagers are their own worst enemy. You know, if you're the leading family of Wilberforce or Leconfield or Bishop Burton in the early 16th century, you've probably already begun to see the way that the wind is blowing. And you probably are the sort of person who will now become the next middleman and get rid of these villages. But if you're a young enterprising lad and you've learned actually, sod the turnips, I'm going to get some sheep and sell them at market and I'll become rich. And my villagers, neighbours can just go hang.
Very interesting talk, Marcus.
Thank you.
And the main thing was there's a lot of smuggling on this coast. And the main stuff was wool being smuggled out of the country.
Yes.
And they brought back in gin, pottery, tobacco.
Yeah. And by the way, the Beverley merchants are really, really, really naughty in terms of they do smuggling in the Middle Ages as well. But largely to avoid, I mean, smuggling is largely there to avoid taxes towards custom duties, known as cocket duties in the Middle Ages. But the medieval merchants also claim the right to sort of develop the wool into cloth and to dye it and export it. So they do set up cartels. There is a cartel of Beverley together with Driffield and Pocklington to stop other towns or villages to make wool and to export it. They could only use wool for domestic production. York and Beverley claim to have the right that nobody within 10 miles of them can actually sell wool without it going through Beverley itself and through a Beverley merchant. The Beverley merchants are naughty, but also they're very successful. And I suppose in the economic world, you have to be quite ruthless. Do a similar thing with wine and as vintners. And even the king has to order at one point that the vintners of Beverley have set up a cartel with some of the other towns and villages to sell a gallon of wine for 6 pence or 12 pence, double the price it is in Hull, and the people of Hull are complaining, and double the recommended laws set down by the Crown, which governs the sale of wine and bread and ale. And Pocklington emerges out of the wool trade. There's a case of the, I mean Phil Gilbank, who leads the Pocklington History Group, once described them as the Pocklington Six. There's a case of 6 weavers in Pocklington, an extra one in Barnby Moor, who are illegally producing wool and cloth for export down with assistance of people from York and Beverley, and they're fined as a consequence.
By the way, people in Hull are still complaining that Beverley's expensive.
Thank you, first of all, for a very interesting lecture and answering the questions. 2 things. You were talking about the fact, you were talking about the fact that there was evidence of houses being expanded and additional structures being added. In certain time periods and certain cultures, when a new building was created or an old one was partly dismantled, there was evidence of some sort of offering being made, some kind of symbolic form. Was there any evidence of that found in any of the excavations? And just to come back to the issue of the quality of wool, I remember reading, and I cannot for the life of me remember where, but it was a book on Italian economic history. And one of the comments there was that the Italian wool trade was very badly damaged because of the fact that they were trying to mix goat's hair with wool from sheep, and a way of saving money, but it backfired on them.
The second part I'll deal with first. Yes, I'm familiar. There are references of goat's wool being used as a substitute or combined with wool, and not terribly sort of working. And there are also attempts to try to improve the quality of wool with what I suppose is today as a modern-day form of cashmere or Angora wool, and trying to create a higher quality wool. But the Italian banks, the banks of Lombardy and the banks of Venice, largely come into being in existence in the 13th century because of the wool trade. And their fortunes are completely tied up with the wool trade. And when the wool trade gets a cold, then the banks sneeze. And you start to see this capitalist system developing more and more. The first part of your question, no, I haven't really, but I suppose there's only so much we can expect to find that would commemorate that. The Monk's Walk pub down Highgate, where I do the Poets and Pilgrims talk, and there's one next Wednesday about the Canterbury Tales and the Miller's Tale. Now, they do tie in with these talks, because obviously in a medieval village, probably the most important person after the absent lord of the manor, and the person that's fleecing you more than anybody else is the miller, because he actually is making your bread and your corn, but he's overcharging you and taking 10% of your corn away and selling it to himself at a profit. That's what we're talking about next week at the Monk's Walk. And there, obviously, it's largely an early 18th century building, but there are dates carved into some of the clearly medieval oak panelling. There's certainly a 1671 date. There may well be earlier dates. There's no reason to suppose that it's probably a 14th century pub. And maybe we just haven't found other ideas. Around this minster, there's loads of pillars of medieval graffiti. Not just of ships and all sorts of things. There are names and there are dates. So I imagine they probably would have done what, of left dates. Or I remember as a child, when we were about to move from Stamford Bridge to Wilberforce in 1986. I'd have been 12 or 13. And we had a lovely old house. I deliberately stuffed down the skirting boards little notes and letters for a future owner to find out the date. Pointless stuff. But they probably did similar things in the Middle Ages. Next question.
You mentioned briefly earlier on lay subsidies. Now, I know they're quoted a lot on the Beresford website as evidence of changing population in the medieval villages. Yeah. What are they?
It's a tax, basically. The biggest one we have records for is a lay subsidy of 1334, and they do give a very good indication of how much tax has been paid from the village community, which we can extrapolate some sort of population figures from. But basically, it's a one-off tax to the king to pay for war. So invariably either the Anglo-Scottish Wars or the 100 Years' War. There is no income tax in the Middle Ages. There are just generally one-off taxes, such as the poll tax, lay subsidies, and later on you have things like the half tax, window taxes. Income tax is created to fund the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, and was meant to should have stopped after Waterloo. So when you write to Rachel Reeves about today's budget statement and tax rises, you can say, this income tax malarkey tax, it was meant to stop in 1815. Why are you still doing it?
Yeah, just a quick one. You've talked about all the wool coming through Beverley for hundreds of years. was it all shipped straight out as fleeces, or was there some industry in Beverley where it was worked on before it moved on?
To begin with, it was shipped straight out, but then actually you do get dyers, and hence Dyer Lane, that we got off the Saturday market, where there used to be a Beverley bookshop down there. It's now the Oh My Dog shop. So clearly there's dyeing activity, colouring the cloth. And the decline, the main decline of Beverley economically, it isn't just simply it will be completely finished off by the loss of Calais in 1558, which basically completely transformed. It's like Brexit in reverse, really. We're sort of kicked out of Europe, and actually it means that it's difficult to export our war trade. But, and I mentioned it so many times in my talks, the discovery of America and the New World as a result of 1492 and Christopher Columbus completely changed the scene and brings in inflation for the first time. And it means that the population begins to move from the east coast to the west coast, to Liverpool and to Bristol. And this is what really means that Beverley loses out, because the textile towns of Leeds and Bradford in the late medieval period, 16th century, will grow, and Halifax and Dewsbury, and they'll start to make the woolen cloth, and they will take over, and then the Lancashire cotton mills will start to kill off what's left of the wool trade, until, of course, you know, the independence of India and Mahatma Gandhi will then start to kill off the Lancashire cotton trade. So everything has its day. A fleece of wool now, I think, only costs about 60 or 70 pence, doesn't it? It's ridiculous, really.
Anything else? I can add in, just I did a little bit of research on some of the Cistercians. Apparently by the end of the 12th century, Mews had converted 8 of its converting cow buyers to sheepfolds. So the abbeys were at it as well. They actually had, just at Sutton alone, and this was only one small bit of their estates, they actually had 2,000 sheep pastured down at Sutton. It was, of course, the medieval abbeys, particularly the great big Cistercian ones, were major people. Fountains also, it actually wiped out 3 whole villages to create one of its so-called granges, which were kind of the outlying satellites for the abbey.
There is disturbingly, the church does not seem to be any better a landlord than any other earl or baron or member of the nobility or Beverley merchant is. The church will tear you out if they can make sheep out quite easily. The thing that often surprised me, or always puzzled me, and it shouldn't have done, and it must do to everybody in Beverley, is how is it we have this magnificent building, Beverley Minster, the size of a cathedral? Who paid for it? How did Beverley have the amount of money to build this and St. Mary's Church as well? Particularly since St. Mary's was the merchant's church. But they managed to build both of these from stone that comes from Tadcaster, near Sherburn in Elmet, near Selby, has to be brought all the way over here. It's even bigger than Southwell, or even bigger than Ripon. And how do you get such wonderful churches like Patrington, the Queen of Holderness, Heddon, Hessel, Cottingham? These are magnificent churches. It is the wool trade that paid for it.
Right, well, thank you very much indeed, everybody, for coming. I think Daniela will play us something just to sort of round off the evening in suitable fashion. Hope she doesn't get driven out of wherever she's living at the moment. Daniela, thank you very much. Yes.